It's the year 1914, and a man named Carl Eric Wickman created one of the largest and most successful transportation services of all time, Greyhound lines. But in the modern world, there are other methods of transportation. There's cars, planes, and other means of travel that can be faster and even more convenient. The majority of cities in the world have numerous forms of transportation, sometimes even too many to count. But in a place like Northwestern Ontario, it's a completely different story. It sits adjacent to the largest freshwater lake by surface area in the entire world. It's known for its forests, natural beauty, and wide diversity of cultures. The most populous city in the region is Thunder Bay, with just over 100,000 people, but there are several other smaller communities scattered throughout this region. Many people in these communities rely on busing as a primary form of transportation to access critical services such as healthcare. But the issue is, although these services are needed, they aren't always in high enough demand for a private company to justify the costs. When Greyhound Lines announced the cutting of these services, citing overall declines in ridership, there was a massive void left within the industry, and it wasn't at all clear who could try and fill it. Greyhound previously received government subsidies to operate across Canada, but once these dried up under the Stephen Harper Conservative government, the services they provided went along with it. But the provincial government has not stepped up, and there are only a few small companies providing this service within the region. Greyhound refused to continue its operation at full capacity without the government assistance necessary to, at a bare minimum, break even with typical operation. In order to fill the gaps left by Greyhound, Casper Transportation stepped up and began to operate from Thunder Bay west to Winnipeg and east to White River using more cost-effective, reliable, and efficient vehicles. They may not be the large coach-style buses that ran prior, but without government assistance and subsidies, small businesses simply cannot operate at that capacity. The demand for busing services in Northern Ontario is small, but incredibly necessary. On a given day, 2 people may require transit from Fort Frances to Thunder Bay. But they both may require urgent medical care that these smaller communities just can't provide. There is no justifiable way for a small business to run larger buses that cost upwards of $500,000 on these routes. Using one of these buses, let's say that for the route from Fort Frances to Thunder Bay, 3 people ride it every day for an entire year non-stop. If you charge them $100 per ticket, which for these routes is an incredibly fair price, that's $109,500. Now, you have to take out the cost of fuel, insurance, depreciation, the wages paid to the driver, and all other associated costs. What you're left with is a one-way ticket to bankruptcy, no pun intended. Ontario Northland, which is a provincially owned and operated company, has lost $106 million in 2019 and over $60 million in 2020. With Northland not being required to operate within the same restrictions as Casper Transportation is, how does a small business compete against a government who is willing to lose over $160 million over 2 years?
The owner of a local passenger busing company says he feels betrayed by Minister Greg Rickford and the Ford government. This week, Rickford announced the provincially subsidized Ontario Northland is expanding bus service in the Northwest. ONTC will now run buses 6 days a week between Thunder Bay and Winnipeg. It's also adding a new route to Atikokan, Fort Frances, and Emo. That will likely mean fewer customers for Casper Transportation. The private company already offers 5 weekly routes from Thunder Bay to Fort Frances and others across the region, including from Sioux Lookout to Winnipeg. Owner Casper Wobinski says Ontario Northland can drastically undercut his ticket prices as the agency doesn't have to turn a profit.
It's not fair that a tax-paying business has to play by one set of rules, and then the government has a whole separate set of rules for government agencies. At bare minimum, they should be forced to break even. There's no need for ONTC to be losing $62 million. At bare minimum, they should be mandated to not to lose money and break even, and they could easily do that by just making their pricing what it's supposed to be. Now, some people may not be happy about that, but somebody else has to pay for it.
Minister Greg Rickford claims there's still an opportunity for the private sector to fill the remaining transportation gaps in the Northwest. Wobinski says there aren't enough riders to make other routes financially viable, but he has no plans to close his doors or cancel any existing routes at this time.
Since Greyhound started making plans to exit or cut back service, and I'm assuming this happened even before that, the Ontario government has always been keeping tabs on the bus industry. And every so often they update their reports, their plans, for the bus industry and buses in general. It came to my attention that not too many people knew what we were doing when local council members were not acknowledging the services we provide. And that's when I got involved, and Northland approached us in the fall of 2017 with the intention of working with us and creating a private-public partnership. The first thing they said to us was that their job is to do the routes that are not feasible financially. And that's the mandate of the government, that they will go where private industry cannot go. And they have no intentions of being on routes that are potentially profitable or self-sustainable without government involvement. Ontario Northland wanted to decide where we can connect. So that's why we decided originally to connect in White River when ONTC started going from Sault Ste. Marie to White River to Hornpain to Hearst. And they did that for about 8 months before they canceled it because there was no traffic there. They asked us, hey, Casper, get your route going to White River, we'll meet there. So we did the best we can to match their schedule so people could transfer. At one point, ONTC, the whole team came up here, even with an assistant deputy minister. We had even Greyhound officials, the vice presidents, come up here for a meeting, and we all sat down together trying to work out a plan that would work for everybody. Greyhound's position was, we don't care, we're not interested in working with anybody because we've been doing it, there's no need for anybody else. Northland came up here a whole bunch of times, a bunch of phone calls, emails throughout the last couple of years. I'm sure there's records of their travel, emails, documents that we worked on together, all sorts of different things. And the intention was that if we share information in good faith, they would work with us to help us understand what our challenges are and what they need to do to make it work for us so this partnership can come together.
Despite being in talks with the government about forming a public and private partnership, they abruptly decided to directly compete within this region, which is terrible news for Casper Transportation and the employees and their families it directly supports.
Well, I don't think the government realizes the consequences of their decision to use taxpayer funds at a $62 million loss a year to compete with an existing business that employs 40 people. They're putting all these jobs at risk. And if we cannot compete with them and are going to continue trying to undercut our prices, there's going to be consequences. And how are those 40 people plus the other 50 contractors and all the investors and everybody who was involved going to cope with the personal and emotional loss of their livelihoods and their investments? The confusing part is that Ontario Northland is funded by the taxpayer, and they're not mandated to break even. They want to operate as a business, but they lose $62 million a year. On some routes, it's $248 a ticket subsidy, and on some other routes, it's up to $1,000 a ticket subsidy. It is very unfortunate that they do not take the position of fiscal responsibility to run a business fairly. We have to pay our bills. We have to turn a profit. We need to at bare minimum break even, and Northland should be mandated. Minister Rickford should mandate Northland to break even to make sure that the taxpayer doesn't have to foot the bill for politically motivated decisions. There is no way a private bus company could run an operation with a $62 million loss, especially in the bus industry. They would be bankrupt and insolvent in very short order. For $62 million, we could provide transportation in the entire country, not just the province of Ontario. We could provide service from coast to coast and replace all the routes that Greyhound has pulled out on. You do not need $62 million loss to operate in Northern Ontario or in Ontario in general. It can be done without investing so much money every year after year. It's my responsibility as the CEO of Casper Transportation to stand for my employees. They trusted and made a commitment to this company and me as the leader of the company, and I have to back them up. We're going to stay in business, and we're going to continue doing business for as long as possible, and we're going to do our best to improve the services to retain customer loyalty. At the end of the day, we're going to continue to provide affordable services. We're going to continue improving our services in the regions we currently service. Many of our routes have limited demand, have sometimes 0 people, sometimes we have 2, 3, 4 people, sometimes we have 7 or 8, but we do not have enough demand to justify mid-size or large buses. And this is why we choose to use smaller vehicles. Smaller vehicles do not come with bathrooms, but we stop at all the rest stops en route that provide proper restroom facilities. Northwest Ontario relies on our services. A lot of these communities are remote and have limited access to transportation, and not everybody owns a car, and we're the only way in or out. I'm concerned that Northland, under the leadership of the Ontario government, is going to push out existing options, and when the political atmosphere or the political mood in the government changes depending on who is in power and the fiscal demands, they may arbitrarily decide to pull services due to lack of demand for their larger buses. The province is going to lose about $2.5 million running from Thunder Bay to Winnipeg and Thunder Bay Fort Frances to Kenora. And just because Minister Rickford's from Kenora, he can protect that temporarily. But the next minister may not be from Kenora, and those services will be on the cutting block like they've always have been every time there's an election. If they put Casper Transportation out of business, and the next government cuts back with Northland or winds down some of the less performing routes, there's going to be nothing left in the region. We've always been here, we always wanted to be here, and we're going to do our best to be here, and we're going to continue fighting for our customers and our employees for the foreseeable future.
Traveling north from Lake Superior, you will find yourself passing through a set of small isolated communities such as Geraldton. These make up the amalgamated town of Greenstone, and this area, due to its remoteness, has very little industry or economic activity. The people who live here rely heavily on Casper Transportation to get back and forth from Thunder Bay.
Not just Geraldton, there's 6 communities there. Lalac, Caramat, Jellicoe, Beardmore, Nikita. They all rely on Casper, especially wintertime. Not a good time, people don't like traveling, but I'm pretty good with that because the drivers are very good. First of all, we need the service, period. There is no other way to get unless you're driving yourself. You can usually find a ride now and then for friends in the summer, but not the winter. We all know what the roads are like between here and Geraldton and that whole area. So what I noticed is the drivers are very good. I'm not a nervous guy because I've been on those roads all my life, but there's some pretty hairy things happen on that highway. Snowstorms and you can't see your hand, and they're good.
Some people will ride the buses multiple times a week, while others may travel only from time to time. But regardless of how often, these buses run almost every day throughout the entire year.
Sometimes 3-4 times a week, all winter. Meetings all the time, steady. Always on time, always bad conditions or good conditions, very good.
Dealing with current events and an unprecedented global pandemic has been very hard for these small communities. COVID-19 has only underscored the importance of busing services within this region, as it acts as a lifeline for these remote communities.
Well, it's very important before COVID-19, way more important now. Anybody that provides a service, like Casper or anybody else does, we need it because we're down there's not much.
Despite the competition, Casper Transportation will continue its business within the Northwest, but we need to look to the future and decide what really is best for our region. We have historical precedent that the government has been unreliable when providing these essential services, so what's different this time? And the answer is nothing. Within the span of the last 2 weeks creating this documentary, Casper has already been forced to shut down routes and is already feeling the consequences of government intervention. With this newfound competition and uncertainty, the future of bus transportation in Ontario doesn't look very bright. And for those who think Northland is here to stay, please refer back to what I said previously. When the next government gets in, who is to say they don't pull out like they did before? But one thing is for certain, these services are needed, but the question is, at the end of the day, who's going to be able to provide them? This Conservative government ran on the idea of being pro-business for the province of Ontario, but their actions certainly tell an entirely different story.